Hey team, so for this basics video, I wanted to talk about how to read and identify aspects in a birth chart. This is something that, while still a beginner skill set, is a little bit more beginner intermediate, to where even those individuals who consider themselves kind of a step beyond the beginner stage still kind of struggle with exactly how to see or read the aspect patterns in a birth chart. So today we're going to take a second to walk through a couple of different tools that can help you to do that, to be able to identify aspects. And you can kind of see which one works best for you at your current level, and then see kind of how there may be different tools that might require a little bit more, we'll say, elbow grease on your part as for like your next step going forward. So getting started with aspects, there's sort of a lot that you have to know. Like I said, I wouldn't necessarily consider this like beginner exactly, but it is kind of in that level roughly. So we're going to take a second to kind of define some terms before we move on. So first, what is an aspect? An aspect is basically just an angle between two planets. It is a mathematical or kind of geometric relationship between two planets that allows planets to sort of symbolically interact with one another. There are 5 major aspects that are worth looking out for, and each has their own angle associated with it. The first is the conjunction, which takes place between two planets that are about 0 degrees apart, so kind of right on top of each other. The next is the sextile, which takes place between two planets about 60 degrees apart. Next is the square, which takes place between two planets that are about 90 degrees apart. Then the trine, which takes place between planets that are about 120 degrees apart. And then finally, we have the opposition, which takes place between planets that are about 180 degrees apart. And this brings us to our second definition, which is orb. So you may have noticed that when I define the aspects, I use the terms about. I didn't use like an exact measurement as saying, conjunctions are when planets are 0 degrees apart. And while that is true, aspects are given sort of an area of influence around their exactitude to where they're considered to be still in effect. And this is different depending a little bit on what kind of school of thought you tend to follow based on aspects. But generally, the idea is that different aspects or different planets sort of have different ranges of influence that they're given. So as an example, like a trine, which takes place between planets that are 120 degrees apart, it can take place between planets that are, exactly 120 degrees apart, or planets that are more like 125 degrees apart, or 128 degrees apart. But when we start going a little bit further than that, like two planets that are about 130 degrees apart, that might be where we kind of cut off and say, okay, no, these two planets are not actually within trine. They're outside of the orb, and it's either a trine that has recently completed or is moving closer to completion. And that's where the orb comes in. A good rule of thumb is that a 5-degree orb is fine. And this is something that you can kind of revisit, but it's a good beginner place to start from, and you can kind of revisit it as you get a little bit more knowledgeable about aspects and determine or kind of reassess orbs for yourself later on down the road. So while we might often refer to aspects as sort of exact angular measurements, astrologers don't usually reference them as numbers very often. Usually we conceptualize them more as being about relationships between different signs of the zodiac. And that's primarily because that's how we think of the zodiac, or how we kind of construct our charts or think about planets and their locations. So that means that trines, for example, we're going to kind of continue to pick on trines, are measurements of 120 degrees, but usually astrologers think of them more like, oh, the sign Aries and Leo are in trine, or the sign Aries and Sagittarius are in trine, because that's how we denote planetary positions in a chart. And there's a table included in the description below that will depict the different sign aspect relationships for you to refer back to until you kind of have them memorized. So with that sort of preliminary stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and look to an actual astrological chart to see kind of one of our first ways of identifying aspects. So going back to our chart on astro.com, here we can see in the middle of the chart we have our aspect lines. And in the first video I said to ignore these because I feel like astro.com, the way that they draw their charts, overemphasizes the aspect lines as making them more important than they really are. And I still agree with that, I still stand by that, but now we actually need to kind of pay attention. So being able to just look at the chart, just to eyeball the chart and see kind of what signs the planets are in and what degrees they're in is ultimately where you want to get to. That's kind of like the pro or the expert level of reading aspects in natal charts. That's where you want to get to. But obviously, that's a skill that requires a little bit more subject matter knowledge, we'll say, to be able to do well. So getting started, astro.com actually provides a helpful tool on this chart itself. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you see this sort of like half pyramidal structure almost here. This is what's called an Aspectarian. I actually only learned that it had a name a couple of years ago, so that's pretty cool. And what this does is it's basically just columns and rows associated with planetary pairs, and any symbols in these boxes, in these cells basically, indicate information about an aspectual connection. So taking a look at our first line here, we can see that this is the sun column, and then here is the moon row. So this cell here indicates any potential sun-moon aspects. Since this box is a blank, we can tell that there are no aspects between the sun and the moon in this chart. Moving down to our next row, this is Mercury's row, and we see that we have now two boxes to look at, one in the sun column and one in the moon column. So this cell in the sun column in Mercury's row represents any aspects between Mercury and the sun. This one is also blank, so we can tell that there are no aspects between the sun and Mercury in this natal chart. In the next cell to the right, we're now in the moon's column in Mercury's row. So information in this box is going to tell us information about any potential moon-Mercury aspects. And we actually have information in this box. We can see the glyph of the aspect in the bottom left corner, a number in the upper right corner, and a letter here, S, in the bottom right corner. So the information in the bottom left corner represents the aspect type that is forming here. This is the symbol for the conjunction aspect, which, as we know, is an aspect that occurs between planets that are close to 0 degrees, so close to being right on top of each other. The 4 here in the upper right corner, this represents the number of degrees between the two planets. So because the number 4 is here, we know that there are 4 degrees between Mercury and the moon. They are not exactly 0 degrees apart, they are 4 degrees apart. And the letter here, S, means that the aspect is separating, which means that it's basically growing weaker, or that the faster planet, in this case the moon, is moving away from the slower planet, who in this case is Mercury. In this bottom right-hand corner, you're going to have either two letters, S, which is for separating, where the faster planet is moving away, and the aspect is getting weaker, or A, which means that it is applying, or the aspect is getting stronger, or the faster planet is moving closer to the slower planet. Going down a couple more rows to our Mars row and looking at our Sun column here, we can see in the box intersecting these two that there is information, which means that there is an aspect between the Sun and Mars in this natal chart. Because we have this symbol here in the bottom left corner, we know that it is a square aspect, so roughly about 90 degrees. And we can see up here in the top right, the number 9 means that there is 9 degrees separating the two planets from that perfect 90-degree angle. So they're more like 81 degrees or 99 degrees apart from one another. The A in the bottom right hand means that they are applying, or that the Sun is getting closer to Mars. So this can be your first method in getting started in reading aspects in natal charts, just looking at the Aspectarian and following the information contained within it, seeing the information that these different cells contain and what planetary column or row that they are part of to tell you what pair of planets are involved in that aspect. Some of this information is red because it is associated with classically more challenging aspects. Here we'll see squares, oppositions, and conjunctions are usually in red. Those in blue tend to be more harmonious aspects, more helpful, like the sextiles and the trines. And then everything that is in black or green are more minor aspects that really aren't that important at this stage of your learning. So don't focus on them so much, but maybe come back to them a little bit later when you have a better handle on the conjunction, sextile, trine, square, and opposition. So the second tool that we might use is what's called an aspect bar, and I really like these. Honestly, when it comes to teaching people how to read or identify aspects in natal charts, I think these are very helpful for getting started. These are a little bit more hands-on than the Aspectarians that are included in the Astro.com charts because they require a little bit of information processing, we'll say. So basically the aspect bar is just a bar of numbers, you can see from 0 to 30, and these represent the degrees in a zodiac sign. Like we've talked about in other videos, the signs of the zodiac each contain 30 degrees. So basically what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to write in the planetary positions and signs along this bar based on the degree that that planet is placed in. Then you know that planets that are close to each other on the bar are likely within orb of an aspect, assuming that the signs that they're in form an aspectual relationship. So just kind of to walk through an example, we're going to use the same chart from before, but I'm going to fill in some of the planets until we get an aspect to talk about. So different people will have their different methods of how they like to go about filling in the information, whether that's kind of like how we talked about in our first How to Read a Chart video, where it was just, start from the ascendant and go around the circle until you come back to the ascendant, and every planet that you run into, write down, make sure you don't miss anybody. But I personally just think about the planets in a certain order called the Chaldean order, where we talk about planets from fastest to slowest, starting with the moon. So I'll look at this chart and I'll say, okay, the moon is at 14 degrees Aquarius. Here's 15, so 14 is right next to it. So I'll put moon Aquarius. Moon is at 14 degrees Aquarius. Then Mercury is the next fastest, which in this chart is at 10 degrees Aquarius. So I'll go over here to 10 degrees and I'll write Mercury and Aquarius, just like that. And so I can already see that, Mercury and the moon are within 4 degrees of each other and both in Aquarius, so I know that those planets are conjoined. Continuing on, the next planet in this order is Venus, who is at 7 degrees of Capricorn in this chart. And so 7 degrees is right here. I'll write in Venus and Capricorn there. And I can see, these two planets are pretty close. They look like they're about 7 degrees apart on the bar. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, do Capricorn and Aquarius form an aspect? They don't. So even though these two planets are close to each other on the bar, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be an aspect with one another. From here we go to the Sun as the next planet, which is at 24 degrees of Capricorn. So we can go over here, 25 degrees is right here, 24 is right next to it, and draw in the Sun, who is in Capricorn here, and he's pretty far from everybody, you see. So right now we can kind of already see that the Sun's probably not an aspect with anybody just because of how far away he is from them on the bar. Not even considering signs at this point, just distance on the bar. Then the next planet is Mars, who is at 3 degrees of Taurus. So we'll go over here and write Mars down in Taurus. Next is Jupiter, who is at 5 degrees of Aquarius in this chart. So we'll just go right here and we'll write Jupiter, Aquarius. And we can see, okay, Jupiter and Mars are pretty close to one another, about 2 degrees separated from one another. And then you have to ask, okay, what signs are we in? Mars is in Taurus, Jupiter's in Aquarius. Do those two planets have any kind of aspectual relationship? You'll go and you'll check your table that I included in here, and you'll see that yes, these planets are, these signs are in a square with one another. So that means that Mars and Jupiter, because they're so close to one another by degree in these two signs which share a square aspect, then these two planets must be in square with one another as well. And then we're going to kind of wrap it up with Saturn here, who is at 3 degrees of Aquarius. And this is where it can kind of get kind of weird, where you have different planets sharing the same degree. So we're going to put a little line there to say, oh, Saturn's actually over here. But because Saturn and Mars are in the exact same degree, 3 degrees, in Taurus and in Aquarius, which we just talked about as being in square with one another, then we know that these two are also in square. And you could go on and you could do, the ascendant. We'll do the ascendant here as well, which is at 23 degrees. So we'll put ascendant, 23 degrees Aries here. Like you can include other points on here, like the ascendant, or like the nodes, or the part of fortune, or Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto if you want. But I'm just going to do with these just for this example. But this is basically how an aspect bar works. It just puts planets close together on a bar, on kind of one straight line, for you to then eyeball a little bit easier than having them kind of displayed all across a giant circle, basically. But there is kind of one downside or one weakness in the aspect bar. While I do think is a great next step for those who are trying to get a little bit better at identifying aspects, the weakness is at the extremities of the bar. planets that are close to the beginning of a sign and planets that are close to the end of the sign, aspects can reach across sign borders. So it's more difficult to depict planets as being in aspectral relationships if they're far over here. If you remember from our example where we looked in the Aspectarian, it noted that the Sun and Mars were 9 degrees separated from a square. Well, that's not happening this way, right? Like, it's not happening across down the sign. It's happening because the Sun is kind of going to the end and reaching to the other end through the beginning of Taurus to aspect Saturn. I'm sorry, to aspect Mars. And that's a little bit more difficult to depict when we're doing a bar. For that, you'll need our next handy-dandy tool, which is an aspect wheel. The aspect wheel is basically the same concept as the aspect bar, but because it's a circle, it allows planets that are near to the beginning of a sign and the end of another sign to be depicted accurately as kind of close enough to one another to be within orb. So just kind of going ahead and going forward with our example that we started with, seeing Mars here at 3 degrees Taurus and the Sun at 24 degrees Capricorn, it's easier to see why the Aspectarian considers them to be in aspect with one another than it is to see this same thing depicted on the bar, which kind of views them as on two ends of the extreme. Of course, it would be easier to see if the Sun were like in 27, 28, or 29 degrees, but that's not where he's at. But you basically do kind of the same thing. You just fill in where the planets are in their signs. We had the Moon at 14 degrees Aquarius, Mercury at 10 degrees Aquarius, Venus at 7 Capricorn here, Jupiter at 5 Aquarius, and then Saturn was also here and 3 Aquarius. And so having already kind of displayed here on a circle makes it look a little bit easier, because then you can easily apply orbs based on whatever you're using. Like if you're saying, okay, everything within 5 degrees of Mars is going to be considered for an aspect with them. So we see Saturn is in 1 degrees, we've got Jupiter in 2 degrees, and then we've got Venus in 4 degrees here. So all this, like this whole section of the chart, like if we were going to do 5-degree orbs, we would say, you know, from here to here, any planet in this section of the chart could be in an aspect with Mars depending on the sign relationship, and then you would just check to see what that is in the table. Taurus and Aquarius are in square, Taurus and Aquarius are in square, and Taurus and Capricorn are in trine. So we would be able to tell from this that Mars is square Saturn, Mars is square Jupiter, and Mars is trine Venus. And then our final method of identifying aspects in natal charts would just be the eyeball method, which is, in my opinion, the more advanced methodology, one which I think most professionals utilize, where you just look at a chart and are able to tell based on planetary positions, based on degrees, based on numbers that are close to one another, and based on sign relationships, which is all, you know, subject matter knowledge that you would have at a more professional level. You just kind of instantaneously determine aspects from there. Most chart software is going to include aspect lines that are going to help you draw the attention to the right places that you need. It can be a little bit annoying because, as you can see, we've got kind of a lot of lines in one space, which can be more difficult to tell what's happening where. But with planets that are a bit more spread out, it's a little bit easier to see. So basically all you would do is you would follow lines between the points that they're connecting to be able to tell or get information about what it is that they are connecting. So most everything is kind of displayed in this quadrant of this chart. But as we can see, there's a blue line that begins here on Venus, and then it goes on and kind of splits into two, and one connects with Mars and one connects with Uranus. This blue line here, cut across the signs Capricorn and Taurus, represent the trine. So we would say, oh, Venus is in trine to Mars, and Venus is also in trine to Uranus. And then coming over to kind of this massive red here, it's kind of similar stories where red lines connected to the Moon, Mercury, and Jupiter are splitting off into two connected between Mars and Uranus. So we've got kind of the Moon square Mars and Uranus, we've got Mercury square Mars and Uranus, and Jupiter square Mars and Uranus, and Saturn square Mars and Uranus. So kind of a lot going on there. But it's sort of that eyeball method that the lines can help you figure out, which is a bit more of a professional step up. Beginner level is much more using that Aspectarian to give you the information that you need. It requires the subject matter knowledge of at least knowing what the different aspect glyphs are. And those are pretty easy. They're mostly just the names of the shapes that the aspects are named after. Step 2 is then kind of using either the aspect bar or the aspect wheel, whichever one kind of makes more sense to you conceptually. I really like these tools. I don't think they're used enough for people kind of making that jump up, and they can be a really great intermediate step, which just requires you to kind of put into practice your knowledge of sign aspect relationships. And then finally, being able to eyeball it yourself off of the chart is going to be kind of your master level step. So those are some helpful tips on how to get started on reading and identifying aspect patterns within natal charts. Hopefully one of those 4 tools, either the Aspectarian, the aspect bar, the aspect wheel, or ultimately just being able to eyeball the chart itself and be able to read aspects from there, have helped you or have given you something to work with to help you advance further along in your studies. Tune in next time for our next basics video, where we're going to kind of start a series on the zodiac signs themselves and what considerations come together to give the signs their meanings and interpretations.